What if addiction isn't just about bad choices? What if addiction is often the result of pain that was never addressed, environments people grew up in, and systems that failed to intervene early enough? They should have said something, go, why didn't they? Maybe they didn't have the words for it. Millions of Americans struggle with addiction every year, but behind every statistic is a real person, a son, a daughter, a parent, or even just a friend. Today on Outreach with Reggie, we're talking about addiction, where it begins, how exposure shapes the outcomes, and what communities must do to break the cycle. So, with that being said, stay tuned. Welcome back to Outreach with Reggie. I'm your host, Reggie Holloway. This podcast is about showing up, speaking out, and creating change within our communities. Today we're tackling a topic that touches nearly every family in America in some way, shape, or form, and that is addiction. To start us off, according to National Public Health data, over 48 million Americans struggle with substance use disorders, or substance abuse to be simplistic. That's nearly 1 in 5 people. But addiction isn't just about drugs or even alcohol. It can involve behaviors, environments, trauma, and just systems that shape how people cope with pain and stress. Today, we're going to explore what addiction actually is, the different types of addiction, how early exposure affects people, the role institutions play, and ultimately how communities can break the cycle. Because if we want real solutions, we have to talk about the root causes. So to start us off, we must ask the question, what addiction really is? One of the biggest misconceptions about addiction is that it's simply about willpower. People often say, why don't they just stop? Or, I'd never do that. A very dismissive and ultimately a very unfair ideology behind just giving it a break. Because addiction is far more complicated than people give it credit for. Addiction actually affects the brain's reward system. And several of people who believe what they do is quite normal may not know it is addiction. People who are addicted to coffee, but we'll get to that later. Substances or behaviors that release chemicals like dopamine that make a person feel temporary relief or pressure. These are what we call the effects of the brain. And over time, the brain begins to depend on that stimulant that you are searching for. And eventually, the person may not even be chasing pleasure anymore. They may be simply trying to avoid withdrawal, pain, or emotional distress. And that's why addiction is considered a medical and psychological condition. It's not simply a moral failure. It's not simply something that you can sweep under the rug or simplify it anymore. It requires a healthy discussion. But within that, we must address the types of addiction. Because when people hear the word addiction, most immediately we think about drugs, the war on drugs, right? But there are people who would deem themselves normal. For my coffee enthusiasts, for my gym bros, or my gym workouts, for the people who love themselves a nice bit of eating, foodies, as they say, for my gamers, for my, what else we got? For my people who are a fan of all types of internet gambling or betting on sports betting. They may not realize it, but that may be addiction, because addiction takes on several forms. But to start us off, we have substance addiction. This includes things like opioids, prescription medications, alcohol, stimulants, illicit drugs. The opioid crisis alone has impacted communities across the entire country. Tens of thousands of people who are on opioids. Tens of thousands of overdose deaths occur every year. And many people struggling with opioid addiction actually begin with prescription medications for injuries or medical conditions. But oftentimes enough, the pain rises, and sometimes so does the increase on the medicine. Another addiction that we look at is alcohol addiction. Alcohol is one of the most socially normalized substances. Yet alcohol dependency can quietly develop over time because drinking is often culturally accepted, especially in college. My God. Rave parties, college frat parties, at the football game or sports game, you name it. This is oftentimes the introduction to alcohol. And because it's so culturally accepted, people sometimes overlook how serious alcohol addiction can become. Now, as those are physical, sometimes physical, or what we know it to be as physical addictions, there's also something that we can understand it to be as behavioral addictions, because addiction isn't always chemical. There are also behavioral addictions that can alleviate, heighten a sense of behavior. And these behavioral addictions include gambling, gaming addiction, social media, shopping, and even pornography. Because these behaviors can trigger the same reward systems in the brain that chemical substances do. Over time, the person may feel unable to control their behavior, even when it begins harming their life. But when does addiction risk begin? Because oftentimes enough, you don't trip, fall, and stumble into addiction. Not in the slightest. For many people, risk actually begins much earlier than adulthood. I know earlier I mentioned college, but oftentimes enough, it starts earlier than that. Early exposure plays a huge role. Often enough, it's generational, but how does it become generational? It really goes into what you're exposed to, early exposure. Children may grow up seeing adults cope with stress through substances. They may experience trauma, instability, or environments where emotional support is limited or not even talked about at all. How often, and this is a question for you, in your family, have you had the opportunity to talk about your emotions? Or, a better question, how was emotions regulated within your family household growing up? Was there room to talk about emotions, or did you find yourselves or the adults in your household escaping from those conversations? Because this is important. These are the breeding grounds for what we may find escapism to be. Maybe it's mom overspending on Amazon. Dad, oftentimes enough, you can find a case of beer or a beer can attached to his hand almost every day, all day. Maybe it's a Left Behind magazine sitting out in the open. Maybe it's multiple bags of caffeine, coffee. All of these things matter. And when we don't know how to regulate our emotions, and there's more escapism than there is healthy conversation, its breeding ground. And gently, addiction creeps in. Research consistently shows that individuals who begin using substances before the age of 15 have a very much likelihood of developing addiction later in life. That doesn't mean exposure guarantees addiction. There's plenty of people in this world that have had a relative, either distant or close, that's come around them, and or even a friend that may have offered, like, hey, I have a little bit of this. If you want to try it out, I heard it's cool. But that doesn't mean exposure guarantees addiction, because you can always say no. But it does mean early environments matter a whole lot. But I want to go back to something. I want to talk about the role of family. The role of family. Because family is the first institution most people experience. It is your first glance or first understanding of what the world is through family. Families can be places of safety, love, and stability. But sometimes, as we learned throughout the podcast, there can also be places where unhealthy coping patterns are passed down. Children learn by observing. They learn by observing the habits, the patterns, the regulations of how the household is as their first point of view of learning. Learning doesn't start at school. Learning starts at the home. And what you observe at home, that's what you understand it to be. If they see adults handling stress through substances, through drinking, through drugs, through other things, if they see emotional pain ignored, if they see if mental health conversations never happened, if the talk of depression is treated like nonsense, those patterns can quietly shape how they respond to stress later in life, creating a generational impact. And those patterns can repeat for generations if they're never addressed. Another thing is about the education and early intervention, because schools are another important institution. Teachers and counselors are often amongst the first people who notice when something may be wrong, something might not be quite right within the household. And depending on where you are, that may cause itself to either cause more infriction, a heavier burden down, or may cause an early start to a beautiful conversation to be had. But many schools face major limitations. Some schools have hundreds of students for every one counselor. Or for every counselor, they may have 100 students. Mental health education is still limited in many districts, and some behavioral issues are handled with punishment rather than understanding root causes. Are there trauma-informed, trained counselors and teachers at these schools? Those are questions to be had. Because when systems focus only on discipline instead of support, early opportunities for intervention can be missed. But how do we go on later in life, or even as we understand from the parent's perspective, and as you grow up and go into your 20s, 30s, and 40s and entering to adulthood and all that comes with adulthood, the work, stress, and adult addiction? Because addiction does not just affect young people. Adults often face enormous pressure, that being financial stress, long work hours, job instability. The job market right now is crazy. And ultimately burnout. For some people, substances or addictive behaviors become ways to escape that pressure. What begins as occasional relief can slowly turn into dependency. Things that we look at as escape or the luxuries of entertainment, right? The things that we indulge. Once as a enjoyment can turn into the very thing that we depend on to get us through what we're experiencing. But let's go talk about societal norms. College being the biggest place to where heavy drinking is sometimes the norm, that being at your sports game or even as parties are going on. Society sends mixed messages about addiction. Certain behaviors are often normalized. The overindulgence on coffee, working out, that being, oh, you got to stay fit, you got to stay clean, but no one looks at the person that stays a little bit too long at the gym. The foodies, right? Exploring your favorite restaurants. Over in time, no one looks at the overeaters. Sometimes we do with judgment, but I'll preserve my thoughts on that. Other times like shopping, over shopping, spending until we spent our entire check, oftentimes enough struggling to survive until we meet our next one, only to repeat the cycle again. Video games for the gamers out there. Spending hours of time, spending hours of our lives not going to sleep. These are sometimes normalcies to addiction that we don't call addiction. Media can glamorize substance use. And we see it all the time in music. Yet at the same time, people struggling with addiction often face stigma and judgment. That contradiction from what we see online on social media. Even social media is an addiction. Ask yourselves, when can you put down Instagram, Facebook, TikTok? The fun of scrolling up and down your screen. If you could you put it down for a day? But how in one case where we can glamorize it here on the internet, the use of internet, what we make in a society in this way. But if we go down in our local downtown area, wherever we are in America or elsewhere, we can cast judgment upon the homeless, youth, homelessness people in general. If they ask for $1, we used to say, get a job. You need to find a better hustle. Get off the drugs. Get off the bottle. If we can match the understanding of what we've made normal from what we've seen, if we can match the understanding that we can have, the capacity of grace we can have for the beginning of addiction, the same way we can have the understanding and grace for the pitfalls of addiction, then maybe we can have understanding and start the healthy conversation that is needed around addiction. Then we can make some magic happen. We must have understanding from both sides. And to talk about that, I want to talk about the story of two paths. I want you to imagine something. Two kids growing up in similar environments. Both face a good enough amount of stress. Both see unhealthy coping patterns around them. Let's call them, for the sake of conversation, Marcus and Jordan. Now, Marcus and Jordan, for the sake of this segment, is made up. They don't exist. But Marcus grows up seeing alcohol used to deal with stress. No one really teaches him alternative coping mechanisms or mental health strategies or therapeutic strategies. The school notices behavioral issues, but mostly responds with discipline. Over time, Marcus carries those patterns into adulthood. Stress piles up, and eventually, occasional use turns into dependency. Now imagine Jordan. Jordan grows up in a similar environment, but a teacher notices he's struggling. A counselor gets involved. A mentor connects him to a youth program. Jordan still faces challenges, but he has tools now. Support systems that are in place for him to have guidance. And that is the difference. That difference changes the direction of his life. The difference between Marcus and Jordan isn't that one is stronger. The difference is exposure, intervention, and support systems. I was thinking about this topic when I was thinking about the show The Wire. And as you see, there's a character named Dookie or Duke, and his family hard on addiction. And because there's not too many people outside of Presbo, his teacher, as much as he wanted to help, he really was limited in capacity as a teacher, what he could do. And after trying so many resources of trying to do things the right way, he ultimately fell in the end to addiction. Such as Michael, due to his environments, led to a life of crime. But we saw characters like thinking about his name. Pretty much in the end, his environment changed, which allowed him to be in a better place in life where he can be the responsible young man he always wanted to be. But it's a matter of the exposure, intervention, and support systems that allow realities to where betterment can happen. And it allows us to break the cycle. But what does breaking the cycle look like? If addiction can be influenced by environments and systems, then the solution must exist in those very same places that we may find addiction to be. Oftentimes enough, I talk about how trauma must be met with truth. Where did it start? And how can we move forward? Communities can help by investing in mental health education, youth support services, mentorship programs. Even if that means the community comes together and if they see a young man or a young lady down on their luck or staring down the wrong path in life, even if they're taking one step into the wrong direction, you have a conversation with them. Addiction treatment access, reducing the stigma around seeking help. If we could come at a capacity or have a capacity to search deep within ourselves to find grace within people, to be daring enough to ask a question, to dare to ask for help, dare to seek help, that we must have grace and mercy and understanding in those who want to help. When communities intervene early, they create more Jordans than they do Marcuses, and fewer people fall through the cracks. So, as we reflect on today's episode, addiction is one of the most complex challenges facing our society today. But understanding addiction requires looking beyond the surface. It requires examining pain, exposure, systems, and the environments people grow up in. Recovery is possible. Prevention is possible, but it requires communities willing to confront the issue honestly and compassionately. So, as I thank you for tuning in to Outreach with Reggie, if this episode makes you think, share it with someone. Conversations like these are how awareness spreads and change begins. Until next time, keep showing up, keep speaking out, and keep working to create change within your communities. Like, share, and follow. Until next time, take care.